I was working on stuff, organizing.
You were there too?
Yeah, she was there. I didn't know, and Phil said he was there. I didn't even know.
I got there later.
I didn't know. Yeah, that's so amazing. I would have been so happy if I had looked out there and seen.
For credit for having been the shortest out there.
You were. And for making it go in that way, because literally we cut so many songs, we just cut stuff out because of it. And I think it was actually our own failing that we didn't assume that people don't really know. You know what I'm saying? It's like you got a lot of speakers, so everybody, and so that, you know, people are apt on a continuum, on a spectrum, you know.
Well, and I know, like, I speak all the time, but you're gonna have to really like completely.
Oh yeah, what you know,
Like I enter a
it happens for all of us. I think. Yeah.
See the people, you know, Sarah,
She was trying.
you need an orchestra.
Yeah, oh my God, right. It's like, and then she's small, and the writing was this small.
I know.
Like Sarah Richard.
What was the? That's what you're doing right now. But what was the call to action? That's what I was.
We just were saying, yeah, that is. I told Marvin, you know, I told David, who was like a son to me, I said, I'm going to help you with this, but this is the most upfront that I can be, right? Yeah. And so there's just a lot of clarifying work. Remember how that, like, the Panther Party had a 10-point record? It's like we've got to go back. It's like Sankofa. It's like go take some of the best of the traditions.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? That have radicalized us and helped us. And then you know, reframe, add, augment, take away.
Yeah.
You know, get rid of the limitations and biases. But we need some specific, concrete, because it's just amorphous bunches of nothing. Tell me what to do. Yeah. And so that was something that was not, it wasn't mine to tell, you know, to tell.
Is it kind of David's or is it yours?
Well, you know, he just got invited onto the national, he did, yeah. So he'll be doing a lot of the, yeah, that's right, with Barbara and the other folk, yeah. So, you know, they'll be clarifying stuff, but I think California needs to,
in a week and a half.
yeah, California, and I'm sure, you know, they know more than was expressed yesterday, but still, there's got to be stuff there. And California is its own thing, you know what I mean? And so there'll be things that will be relevant, and not to us, that are different from people in the South and the West or where it's coast.
I approached it from there yesterday. A couple of friends were like, oh, we're involved here. My response is, you know, what are you guys doing? You know, because I think people are signing up and don't know what they're marching on.
What the marching on, yeah.
I think if we had even just a table
Right.
from each other,
Specifics.
you know, like how to connect to each other. Right.
And you know what I think some of the problem is too? I think that some of the problem is anytime you make an effort to do a fusion movement, see, you could see from the speakers, a lot of people were sort of plugging their thing. They weren't talking about poverty at all. You know what I'm saying?
Right. How does it work?
How it feed into, and how are you then going to bring and fuse? So that right. And so it was a good thing that we were able, you know, we know a lot of people, you know, a lot of organizers, and so it was a good thing that we would bring these folks together. But you know, I just sort of like it helped to get people, but it's like that people we should have, somebody should have sort of been clear, and people have been clear in like about where.
Talk about the word thing.
And I think, you know what I think we did, like from the day when we did the thing? People are there oriented, it's a human condition for you to want to talk about your church or your something, because people get so little opportunity to plug their thing to bunches of people that they feel are like them. Right. Because it's not like we're, you know, religious folks. Right. So people are doing, but that's part of it. It's hard to get the folks and get it fused.
Scary back over about poverty.
it's you know, again, in construction. Watch it. Oh, you guys were magnificent. Just you were doing a dance. So take a look.
We're like the bizarro you guys.
I know, we are. We're like an ultra bizarro thing.
Do you guys have the candy cred?
That's what you, why I don't think we have the candy cred. That's right, I don't think.
I get a photo of the four of you.
You guys know who you are. I'll just casually sleep.
The last picture that was taken of me up here, I was swinging my feet. I couldn't believe. Like, and people, I was sitting like this. Like, oh my God. I'm full of measure to sit on the edge of my seat for authority. It's like, oh my.
Hey, beloved, there's no cheap seats here today, so let's move forward so we can have an intimate, stimulating talk. We promise we will not call on you if you sit in the front row. You can call on these folks. We will not call on you. So let's come as far forward as you allow yourself to. Yeah, for the speaker and writer's egos, please, clump up front, and they can just focus on how dense the crowd is. That was supposed to be a joke. As someone who often preaches to, or does workshops in half-empty rooms, that was for me. Even more further forward? No? I won't call on you individually. Okay. Why don't we get started since it is 1 minute of 12? There are a few folks here who are not necessarily church folks. So I was going to do a quick intro to our church. It goes like this. Welcome to First Church Berkeley, United Church of Christ. We're so glad you're here today. Let me take my gum out. I can talk better. Every Sunday at church, we do a welcome to make sure everyone feels welcome in this space, because everyone is welcome in this space. And some of you know the drill. It goes a little like this. Welcome to you if you're old or young. Welcome if you're queer or straight. Welcome to morning larks and night owls for whom the day is just getting going. Welcome to pessimists and Pollyannas, depending on where we are in the news cycle. Welcome to atheists and Jesus freaks. Social science shows that even atheists are happier when they go to church because community is important. Welcome to Bernie supporters, Hillary supporters, once upon a Trumpers, none of the above, people who want to burn the whole system down. I'm looking at you, Reverend Lynice. Welcome to people of all colors, all genders, all body shapes and sizes, all physical, mental, and emotional abilities, a los con documentos y los sin documentos. Because we are here together today, this body is whole and perfect. Number one, if you are shocked to find yourself in church, maybe you're finding out that our church is not really what you think of when you think of church. We're glad you're here, and we hope you get a little sense of who we are the rest of the week. And if you find yourself with a curiosity or a craving to come back, we're here every Sunday morning worshiping at 10 a.m. We would love to welcome you into the heart of all things, or let you stay comfortably on the edge of things as long as you like. We're going to be talking about some heavy emotional stuff today. Cussing may happen, even from the pastor, but I'll try to control myself. The roof will not cave in. It's a brand new roof that we put on after the fire, and I'm really fond of Mark Twain's saying, it's dangerous to have to repress high-level emotion under certain circumstances. Profanity provides a relief that even prayer does not provide. Lastly, there will be a chance to ask questions pretty soon. I'll warm up the panel with a couple questions, and then we'll take questions in turn from all of you good folks. Because of the brevity of our time with these three amazing people, let's keep our questions. We would really love to hear all about your dissertation topic, but maybe after we finish, if there's a little more nibbles outside. You can see that I know Berkeley. I love you, Berkeley. We all have 3 PhDs, and we want to talk about them. The panelists, Steve Almond. We're so glad you're here today. From his website, Steve Almond does a lot of stuff. I can attest to that. He has 2 more events today after this. He's the author of 9 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers Candy Freak and Against Football. He hosts the New York Times Dear Sugars podcast with his pal Cheryl Strayed, and his new book, Bad Stories, is a literary investigation of what the hell just happened to our country. See, I'm already cussing. You made me do it, Steve. He wrote it to keep from going crazy. Next to Steve is my dear friend and a person who I stand in awe of, Reverend Lynice Pinkard. She's a writer. Yeah! Lynice has been a guest preacher in our pulpit just this past year. She's a writer, speaker, and public intellectual operating at the intersection of Christianity, economics, and social change. She is the co-founder of the vibrant UCC Church City of Refuge in Oakland, the first woman pastor of First Congregational Church of Oakland after that, and now teaches and preaches widely in many contexts in the East Bay and all over, really. And she I hope you're not embarrassed that I'm going to say this, but she just found out that one of her papers is a seminal text for Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow. Like, what? That's amazing. Michelle Alexander is going around telling people about Reverend Lynice Pinkard. And finally, Marvin K. White. You know him, you love him, unless you don't know him. Yay! If you don't know Marvin, he is finishing up his public theologian in residency here at First Church Berkeley and is a recent Yerba Buena Center for the Arts Equity Fellow. Currently, he serves as archivist in residence at the Oakland Peace Center, work we will incidentally get to support with some house parties coming up in June. Marvin is the author of 4 collections of poetry. He's articulating a vision of social, prophetic, and creative justice through his work as a poet, artist, teacher, collaborator, preacher, cake baker, and Facebook statistician. If you're not friends with him on Facebook, you should be, because it's the most fun, especially these days with Facebook, you know. So, onward. I'm going to take a deep breath. Let's all take a deep breath. Steve, I read your book cover to cover. It was awesome. That's saying something. I read a lot of books. I read like 2/3 of a lot of books. Anyone feel me? I read this whole book. It was so good. It was so compelling. You were able to say so many things that I could not articulate myself, but I feel, and that maybe I couldn't even articulate in my own head. And there's something deeply cathartic about having you name some of these truths for us. Okay. Where do I want to start? We have a way of saying in kind of the progressive faith tradition about our own sacred stories. We don't know if it happened exactly this way or not, but we know this story is true, right? So, does that make it fake news? How are we different? How are the stories we tell different from Fox or Breitbart? And you all have your own mics, and you can kind of make eye contact and decide how you want to do this.
The thing that occurred to me first with your question, Molly, is that I think that it comes down to a sense of the discipline. So I do think actually that there's a difference between truth and fact. So let me just say that there are some things that I think are truth that are not necessarily fact. But I think when we tell stories that are truths for us, because it's relative, you know, somebody's right is always somebody else's wrong. But when we tell truths that are true for us, I think that we can't do it without the integrity of fully trying to live into the story, which is a discipline of, as you were talking about, hope. Discipline's not, hope is not a feeling, love not a feeling, faith not a feeling, peace not a feeling, joy not a feeling. It's a discipline. And so we live into the truth of our story, I think, which makes, even if it's a story where we it's a story about ourselves that is just authentic and true, but not necessarily flattering or good. We live into the truth, we live beyond the truth of our story, and I think that provides us a kind of integrity that we don't have if we're not seeking. It's sort of like being a Christian without being a disciple, So I think that's, for me, what came to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is fake news, depending on who's telling the story and who's at the receiving end of the story. We learn in seminary a lot about like the hermeneutics of suspicion and how we bring our lived experience to the Bible to find people that look like us in the Bible. When we think about the Last Supper, we have to imagine somebody had to cook that supper. Somebody had to clean up that supper. It was probably somebody who looked like me, but they are not mentioned in the story. When the story got around that girl got pregnant, but by not somebody really, it was women who probably said that something's not right about this story, And, when Xerxes said, all wives shall obey their husbands, you have to understand that women must have been just wilding out, for them to have to decree such a thing. So it depends on a lot who the fake news either upholds empire or puts down someone else. And we all have to figure out, by bringing our lived experience to the Bible, where the other story is, beneath it.
So interestingly, there's a lot of religious parable in bad stories. Trying to explain to my son sort of the election, we got into a whole crazy theosophical discussion about the golden calf and the impatience that the nation of Israel felt when Moses wasn't coming down from the mountain, and it's taking forever, and they're getting impatient, and so they create this false idol that makes them feel better, right? It's sort of threaded through. And I think what I would say is, the story of some homeless pacifist itinerant rabbi flouncing around the Sea of Galilee, preaching that we should care for the meek and the iniquitous, and overturning the money changers' table. I don't know if there was such a figure, and I don't really care. I think there was an understanding that we're a story-making species, and our predominant shared stories through our history have been religious parables and myth, and there is a question of their historical truth, but I'm not as interested in that. In the modern era, though, storytelling, Breitbart, and so forth, I really think, what are the story's intentions? Are this story's intentions to complicate moral action, to bring our moral imagination to a point of recognizing somebody else's suffering, or is it the opposite? Is it intended to flatten out our morality and enable us to disregard other people's humanity? That is the essence of what propaganda is trying to do. It is an effort to kind of simplify your world in some way by sort of abdicating responsibility for anybody else. And what I define in the book as a good story is not a true story, but a story that is intended to enlarge our humanity. And in fact, what has allowed us to survive as a species. After all, we were a very vulnerable species early in our history, and what allowed us to survive was that we created stories. This is all in the book Sapiens, the brilliant sort of book about bioevolution. What allowed us to survive was that we created stories that extended the bonds of human kindness beyond clan loyalty, beyond tribal loyalty. And every good thing that's come from human beings, what we've been able to do has been predicated on some idea, some set of stories that was told about a common good. And that applies to trade routes and currency and the formation of larger communities, agricultural communities, and so forth. So it's kind of, human beings are kind of a battle. We're full of all these good stories and also full of bad stories. I'm just going to have one chip. That's a bad story, right?
Thank you. I have a bit of a follow-up question to that question. Steve, I was completely terrified to read what you wrote, I think in chapter 3 or 4 or 5, about people hear something, they hear a story, it's not true, it's debunked immediately, and they believe that it's not true, but then if they hear it over and over and over again, if it's repeated enough, they will come to accept it as true. That's terrifying. What hope do we have? And this is a gross generalization, but we on the left tend to like our stories more nuanced. We tend to give in more to purity politics. Well, your story's not completely, we turn toward each other and fight each other. And we are very long-winded, and there's nothing wrong with that because we like to back things up and we like to add that nuance and that depth. But then we're not the ones with the sound bites that we can just, ram into the press, ram into the mainstream media, things that get repeated over and over and become de facto truth. So what hope do we have unless we're willing to play by the same kind of dirty politics and dirty, just immature mindset, black and white thinking, rat-a-tat-tat, sound bites, myth of redemptive violence, here's who the good guys are, that's who the bad guys are, that's the truth.
Thanks for bumming us out. Well, it's true that there is this cognitive quirk that if falsehood is repeated often enough because it's familiar, our mind plays a trick on us and it becomes true because we recognize it immediately. It's a sort of cognitive quirk that propagandists all throughout history have recognized. Tell the big lie, right? It's the reason that that death panels took on such a cogency because it was all that was discussed, right? The story that the left wanted to tell, or just that the common sense political actors in our world wanted to tell us, we would like to at least incrementally improve the healthcare delivery to especially to vulnerable communities in our very wealthy, abundant, country. And that is a good story, but you're right, it's a nuanced, complicated, partial story. What the right has figured out is that they can tell a very visceral, immediate story because they're unmoored from fact and oftentimes, I think, from a functioning conscience. And that story is the government wants to kill your grandmother. The story that the left is stuck with, and I won't even say the left, I'll just say the adult world, is stuck with when it comes to climate change, which is the central existential threat to our species here on Earth Day, is, hey, this species has been roaring drunk on petroleum for 200 years, and the planet's thermostat has gone kaplooey, and we now have to change our entire way of life, which is really predicated on convenience, and we're going to have to fundamentally change and inconvenience ourselves to try to solve this problem for future generations. That's a good story, but it's a hard story to accept. It complicates your actions and your life. Redounds to you to change in ways that are uncomfortable. The right tells a much more seductive story, and that story is there's a bunch of egghead scientists who think you're dumb, by the way, who are making a bunch of money off this hoax called climate change and trying to make you feel guilty for driving an SUV. And I think that's a terrible story. It's fraudulent, it's evasive, it's cowardly, but I understand why people are drawn to it. It exalts their grievance as a way of defending from their vulnerability. And that is a human tendency. It's not located on the right or the left. That's a human tendency.
You made me think of when you said it's a human tendency, I think it's very hard, especially, I'm a progressive person, and I think for a lot of progressive people, it's very hard for us to understand, and I think this is also a human tendency, that we're part of everything that we indict, and there is a way that there is a counter-narrative. There actually is a counter-narrative to the death culture. I mean, my sense is that we're in a death culture, and we're in a nosedive toward death, and we have to buy out of the death culture, and we have to tell the counter-narrative. But if we're not willing to admit the extent to which we are implicated, then it takes something away from our prophetic abilities to name and to call out a counter-narrative and to say that we all don't have to be controlled by this master narrative. There is another way to think of things. There's another way to do things. But then it goes back to the thing about integrity. It's sort of like in the progressive communities, part of what it means to be progressive is that we know more about other people's experience than they do, and that we feel sorrier for people that actually feel sorrier for us. you know. And so I think that, again, you know, it bears out the need for more humility, you know, and being able, I got some of this from both the sermon and from your book, Steve, that we have to begin to open up, and from the service, we have to begin to expand our circle, because if we don't, we replicate the same pieces, you know, and we may not, you know, have a counter soundbite, but we do actually have a counter narrative, and we ourselves, again, have to live into that counter narrative and be able to admit, not just admit, but mourn the ways in which we're not able to do it. I said it last night at the Poor People's Campaign, that we actually need an activism of brokenheartedness, and not just brokenheartedness around what someone else is doing. Amos calls us to brokenheartedness and to mourning, public mourning in the public sphere, right? And Jeremiah calls us to brokenheartedness and to mourning in the public sphere. And there is, the counter-narrative even to that mourning is that there is hope. And joy is one of the most radical things that we can do, but it has to be organic, I think, and not contrived, so.
Amen. Can I tag on that? It's a brilliant thing that was said last night at the Poor People's Campaign, that our heart as a nation is in fact already broken. There's something broken about our heart if we can keep wounding vulnerable people the way we are. So we need a heart transplant. Yes. And are we ready for a heart transplant? And a reminder, after the heart transplant, sometimes the body rejects the organ. So yes. Get ready for that. The patient doesn't always survive the transplant. Brilliant metaphor.
I also think, you know, the book really calls for us to think about the right and the white, you know, and what it means to be people of color and poor people under a propaganda system that calcifies its own story and weakens the stories of the other. So black people living in West Oakland, where coal trucks and all kind of pollutants travel through and down their street, really don't complain about climate change, you know, because at least they have a place to live. And if they complain, then the propagandists will say, look at black people, they don't want you to have energy, you know. And at some point, the internalizing of the propaganda begins to feel like, oh, we are not people who respect the earth. You know, so it keeps working, you know, in this cycle. It's like, you know, it works for the propagandists and works against, you know, the people. And, you know, trying to figure out how to get out of that loop, knowing that that's how the machine works, you know, is my question.
Could I just say one more thing about something that Marvin was saying? You know, we talk about fake news, but the reality of the situation is that the American story is fake news. Right. You know, the reality of the situation is that, you know, and I, you know, want to kind of piggyback on my brother, you know, white people in this country got a 400-year head start. Yes. You know, and so it's like, you know, why is it, you know, that what is accessible even to white people today, no matter where you are on the continuum of how sad you might be about the situation, it is true that it was built on free labor and free land. And that, you know, that was not an accident. That wasn't a mistake. That wasn't sort of an oversight. Yeah. And so now, you know, which just makes my, you know, the whole thing about immigrants seem crazy. I mean, this was manifest destiny. This is their land, you know, and so it's and then through our trade practices and all the things, some of the things that you were naming, it gets more and more and more troublesome. I was thinking about, you know, welfare queens. And can I just say, you know, yes, Donald Trump is some kind of anomaly from another planet. But I think we fool ourselves if we, you know, can't sort of see that all of the presidents, I have them in a couple of categories. It's smooth and groove, or smash and grab. Or smash and crash and brash, which is what we have now. You know, there's just, it's different. I think, you know, what black people in particular loved President Clinton when he was coming into office, and they said he was the first sort of, you know, black person, right, you know, black president. And we just loved him, because he could blow a tambourine and he knew what to do at a black church and he could wear a dashiki. And of course, he was a good-looking white man and all of that. And so black people just thought he had swag. But when you actually look at his policies were to the right of Richard Nixon's policies. And some of Barack Obama's policies were to the right of George Bush's policies. He expanded some things. When you think about Clinton, he repealed Glass-Steagall. That was the basis for the disaster that happened in 2008 around the housing crisis. People playing with money. And you think about the crime bill, you think about welfare queens. Like, really? Black women become the symbol of laziness after 284 years of slavery, lynching, 70-some years of Jim Crow. 1960, 80% of black women were taking care of white people's children and then going home to take care of their own, and then we become the symbol of laziness. I mean, it's just crazy. It's absolutely crazy. All that black people have experienced in this country, and people say violent, violent, violent. Where have you ever seen black people en masse as a group, even as a triad, come together to blow up and shoot up and kill up white people? Never have. I'll wait. If you can think of an instance, I'll wait. Don't worry. So it's, there's so much lie and lie and lie and lie that never gets uncovered. The Enlightenment wasn't a good thing for black people. Our faces were being measured and skulls were being measured and beauty and character or lack thereof being attributed. So fake news didn't just start. And I think that's part of what I want to say.
Yeah. One of the stories that I thought about as the election was going on was a story by Ray Bradbury. I write about it in Bad Stories. It's called "And the Rock Cried Out." And it's a story that was written in 1953 in which a prosperous white couple is down in Central America, some unnamed Central American or South American country. And at the beginning of the story, you see a headline that, Russia and the United States have bombed one another, and it says, "The era of the white people is over." And the rest of the story is dedicated to the sudden and brutal, emotionally and physically brutal stripping away of the privilege that white people have enjoyed. They become prey. And I think that's what I call fear of a brown planet. And I think it is something that bad political actors and demagogues and corporate interests have recognized and weaponized over the past 40 years. Trump doesn't have an original idea in his head. He inherited the ethos and the audience share of the right-wing talkers who created a cult of white self-victimization 40 years ago and have been monetizing it ever since. And people on the left weren't plugged into that set of bad stories. People of color were, of necessity. It was sort of the experience they lived. But, me, a person cosseted within white male privilege, well, I kind of have an addiction to right-wing radio, so I was sort of plugged into it. But I think a lot of people weren't, and they thought, God, where did this come from, this darkness? I do want to say that our political tradition also includes political actors of great foresight and moral force. And I want to read what one of them talked about as a kind of counterweight, because I think we can become mired in a sense of America as an iniquitous actor, constantly privileging sort of the dominant white culture and also capitalism in its sort of merciless algorithm, sort of as our fate. And that's not the case entirely. There have been moments of tremendous moral progress. They're not impossible. They're inconvenient, but they're not impossible. Here's what this politician said. He called for a whole bunch of different reforms to destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics. And then he said, in the struggle for this great end, nations rise from barbarism to civilization, and through it people press forward from one stage of enlightenment to the next. At many stages in the advance of humanity, this conflict between the men who possess more than they have earned and the men who have earned more than they possess is the central condition of progress. In our day, it appears as the struggle of free men to gain and hold the right of self-government as against the special interests who twist the methods of free government into machinery for defeating the popular will. Stop me if you've lived this before. At every stage and under all circumstances, the essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and to give to the life and citizenship of every individual the highest possible value both to himself and to the commonwealth. That is nothing new. All I ask for in civil life is what you fought for in the Civil War. That's Teddy Roosevelt in 1910. That's his new nationalism speech. It holds up pretty well. And I think people say, well, what should the left be saying? That's what the left should be saying. It's not that complicated. It's difficult to say when sort of both parties are sort of, I think in some ways, servants of their donor class. But that, I think, is what is the message. And I think that's not to try to personalize it all, because I really don't care who the person is. I'm interested in what the policies are. But that's what a lot of what Bernie Sanders' resonance was about, was that he was speaking to these kind of core moral values and very clear policies to try to destroy privilege and to give to the life and citizenship of every individual the highest possible value and so forth. Sure.
Forgot I needed to run around. So now it's time for your questions for our incredible speakers. What you got for them? Joe.
So I enjoyed the book, and your comment just now about climate, when you ended by saying, that's a good story, I was a little taken aback by that. So maybe I could ask you to expand a little more on that. And then I keep coming back to, is this something like good news? We're supposed to proclaim the good news. What is that good news we're supposed to proclaim?
That doesn't sound like a good story that, like, you know, we're going to have to totally change our way of life. I guess what I mean is it's a true story, and good stories don't mean they feel good. I love this idea of, you know, hope as a discipline. I think what I mean is it's intended to solve a very real peril that we face. It's the distinction I would draw between the left and the right in the stories they tell is the difference between prophetic literature and apocalyptic literature. So the prophets weren't saying everything's going swimmingly and the nation of Israel has nothing to reckon with within themselves or the world around them. They were saying, you got to get right or it's going to get dark. But apocalyptic literature is really about, it is coming, the rapture is coming, embrace it. And, you know, you will be among the select, and everybody else will burn in hell, and that's pretty much what they deserve. So I guess I want to sort of make a clarification. That's an unpleasant story to have to hear, but it's necessary. No sensible species acts against its own interests in such an astonishingly short-sighted and callous way. That is not a species that can expect to live happily. And we're already seeing this. You know, climate change is here already. Ask anybody in Fiji, right, where they endured a storm of 7 times the intensity of Hurricane Andrew. And it blew away, you know, a tenth of the country was suddenly homeless. It's already here. It's just disproportionate in how we're experiencing it. And I don't think it's a good story in the sense of it's good and affirming, but it's necessary in the same way that medicine is necessary for somebody that's sick. And this part of one of the stories I wish the left was telling is it is unconscionable that our system, our economic system of capitalism has become a centrifuge to concentrate wealth. And this is what Steinbeck was saying. What the heck does somebody need with 100,000 acres of land? This guy who's coming from Oklahoma, the Dust Bowl, he can't even believe it, can't even conceive of it. There's farmers out there with 100,000 acres? What could somebody possibly do? And I think in America we've sort of come to accept that people with extraordinary wealth are to be admired. And there's really a philosophy that is the first cousin of eugenics, which is that people are poor because they're morally defective. This is what this guy Mercer was preaching, the guy who funded Trump. And it's a kind of sickness, and that, I think, does need to be called out in ways that are quite direct, and that redound to us ultimately. I like this idea of everything that we might want to aim at is to one extent or another true of us. Right?
One of the great comforts for me from the Bible, from the Hebrew Scriptures, and the good news is in the Psalms when the psalmist says, God, even the darkness is not dark to you. Because that plays into, I think, a lot of our tropes about lightness and darkness, tropes that white people have played off of for centuries and millennia, that light and white is right and dark is bad. And so I just wanted to put that into the mix too. And, however bad it looks, it doesn't look bad to God. God is going to give us a way out. For me, that's good news.
It's interesting. After reading the stories and bad stories, I'm like, I don't know what to believe anymore. It's not just the story at face value. It's the story that leads to the story. I think a lot about this genre of writing, Afrofuturism, and the ways that Black folks now need to imagine a future where there are Black people. Because at the rate we're going now, we might not make it. And so why do we need to create a future where there's only a possibility that we survive? And so between now and that future is this kind of space we're living in now, this very real, disproportionate rates of incarceration and disease and underemployment and push out and displacement and the wrecking of our cultural preservation sites and just everything. And at the same time, movie studios capitalize on this Afrofuturism by creating a multi-billion-dollar movie about our fear of not being able to survive in the future. So your book messed me up.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve.
I would like to edit that to our country collectively messed you up. And I pointed out some things about,
Another question.
Steve, I think I heard you use the word grievance a little while ago, and it seems to me that being aggrieved is kind of a popular sport these days, and I sort of think it's a spiritual dead end. I'm just kind of curious about what y'all think about grievance and being aggrieved.
You're the star.
Well, there's one of the bad stories in the book is that our grievances matter more than our vulnerabilities. And I think this is really tough because grievance is really a sort of defense against grief and towards a sort of radical recognition that you're vulnerable in the world, that, people who you love are going to be lost to you by death or by them choosing somebody else, or you not being able to find a way together. And I think actually, when I'm in a church community, I sort of get a sense of, I see. Here's where people come together to be vulnerable, to overcome their sense of grievance, to recognize that we live, basically, we're more bound by our doubt and confusion about what it means to be human than by our assurance. That's a great, beautiful purpose that a spiritual community can serve. If you think of the other side of it, Hannah Arendt talks about totalitarian or authoritarian populations as a kind of organized loneliness, that you find some grand narrative that will explain the bad feelings you have inside, feelings that are really at the bottom of it grief, but that manifest as grievance and rage and blame pudding and so forth. And again, I think that there are a set of political and economic actors in the United States who have made a tremendous amount of money and wealth by plugging into people's primal negative emotions and poking at them and building audience by doing that and keeping their grievances inflamed. This is the whole con of a politics of racial resentment for people who really need a politics of economic uplift. I mean, that's kind of an old story, and it's been perfected by the GOP over the last 40 years, but it's nothing new in American politics or in any kind of politics. There have always been actors who have been ready to inflame people's grievance because it keeps them from identifying the people who they really should be angry at, and also this shared sense of fear and confusion that the examined life lets you in for, I guess I'll say.
Just say that I think anger sometimes masked grief, and clinically we know that that's true. I think that that happens. But the other thing that I wanted to say is that when you said our grievances are, our grievances matter more than our vulnerabilities, I think it's sort of a both and. When I think about the children of Israel, for instance, under Pharaoh, that we read about in the book of Exodus, it was a very important first step for them to lament, you know what I'm saying, and to grieve and to start, and to have grievance. To start saying, this is crazy, we can't make, bricks with no straw, we're being made to, that was a very important first step, but I think what has to follow very quickly on that is, this is my vulnerability. And part of it is when for Christmas Eve at First Congregational Church of Oakland, I preached a sermon entitled, Embracing God's Ugly Baby. Vulnerability in the sense is God's ugly baby, or the empire's ugly baby in particular. I mean, we don't have a culture that embraces vulnerability, and we don't get to either grieve or be vulnerable. But I think, at bottom, some of the basis for what we call nonviolent communication is that you simply have an ability to say, when you said this, not you're a mess and I can't stand you, but when you said this, I felt this and I need this. And if we could, in beloved community, because we know that beloved community is not made up of situations where somebody that you sort of don't like moves away and somebody that you really can't stand, moves in. That's community, really, right? And so within the context, the relative safety of beloved community, if we could sort of cultivate our capacities both for real grief, which is under, sometimes I think, the grievance, and vulnerability. I think they go together. They should be Lincoln logged, I think.
And it's also the role, I think, as a writer, as a storyteller, that we bring different voices to the center of the conversation. I am quite certain my mother would have said to Mary, you should wear this Me Too t-shirt. I am quite sure she would be asking a different set of questions had she got to Mary first. It's just, we have to bring in all of the voices, the ones. There's no way that my mama would have looked at Jesus and not felt sorry for, like, what? You gotta die, no. Yeah, it's just like, she would not have seen him as a hero. She would have seen him as a wounded child. She would have seen him, with a future that is not bright, and how do we bring other voices, into the stories as writers and as storytellers and as theologians? How do we surface them and make them challenge the bad stories?
So one thing that you might think about as you're moving sort of, through your life is, if you're tuned in to popular media, every voice that you hear is a voice of assurance. Every voice, they're paid to sound sure of themselves. And, part of we kind of want to cling to that, but we want to cling to it because, God's other ugly child, in addition to vulnerability, is doubt. And, you never hear a newscaster or an anchor or a pundit or a politician say, I don't know, it sounds complicated. I need some time to process. I need to stand in a sense of bewilderment about our circumstance. It's absolutely forbidden in our discourse. And it's completely the trademark of the morally depraved. It's kind of moral surety. It's something I really do associate with the fascist cultures. They're always sure of the answer.
Absolutely, sir.
The central predictor for people supporting Trump, there were two of them. It was not economic anxiety. That was a bad story we told ourselves because we wished that that was the case. But the two, they drilled down, the social scientists drilled down. There were two central predictors. The first was racial resentment. And the second was what they call the authoritarian mindset, which is a mindset that seeks simple, punitive solutions to big, complicated problems. Immigration, big, complicated problem, build a wall, simple solution. It's not authoritarianism, but it's a mindset that's associated with that. They would rather have kids, to break it down, really break it down, they would rather have kids who obey the rules than kids who are creative. Now, I have 3 kids, and I would like them to do both. And I might be making some mistakes in the direction of too creative. Maybe I need some more rules. I'm not calling for sort of all-out anarchy, but I think if you are plugging into those voices of assurance, whether on the right or left, right, you're not really plugging into how human beings function in the world, and therefore you're kind of being indoctrinated in a manner of thinking that's ultimately fraudulent. So you need to tune into other channels, I think.
Dave, I'll take David, then Carrie, while I walk this down for your question. Moving from grievance to grief, I think about Rush Limbaugh, and I think about when we found out he was a drug addict, and then he got sober, and I said, hell yeah! Now he's going to enter a 12-step program. He's going to have to take a fearless moral inventory. He's going to own his vulnerability. This whole shebang is going to change, and it never happened.
I also do too much thinking about Rush Limbaugh. There's a support group out there for us. And I thought of the moment where he went deaf, and I thought they've taken it from him. There is a God. Despite my Jewish atheism, there is a God, and he's taken this guy's speech because this guy has sinned, you know, and then he got his friggin' speech back.
Like Saul on the way to Damascus. Like Saul on the road to Damascus.
Oh, I'm going to put a difficult one. I'm sort of the angry version of what Phil said, which is aggrieved. You know, the question is, you're standing on a bridge, you're ready to jump off, and you hear yet another Trump story, and then the question, there's a reporter or somebody there with you. Should you take them first and then you jump? Every piece has been insight in all you've given us. That's not the gap. We're missing it. The gap is, how do I get going? How do we go? How do we move? I had the pleasure many, many years ago spending a couple hours with Dr. Benjamin Mays. This is a guy that got some 16-year-old guy from Atlanta embedded to Morehouse College, whose name happened to be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the answer is, out of the shade into the street, off your tail, and get it moving. You know, it's sort of, that's what's missing. If I hear one more left thing from Berkeley going on about how this or the other, I literally, before I jump, I might take them with me. You know, it's just, all right, what do you do? And I'm very active in the community. We're doing lots of stuff. That's not the piece. The piece is, you can't just do, you have to think one step ahead and be sort of, as Wayne Gretzky would say, you're going to skate to where the puck will be in first November this year, then November in 2020, and we know that that wouldn't have fixed the issues of the new Jim Crow, because that's been on for 30 years, but it's a start.
So the question is, how do we get going? What's the strategy? What's the strategy?
Seeing those people are filling in that gap of people that you look at and you say, oh, this person knows how to put one foot after another to implement. There's richness in all that you've said to us. But there's this huge gap. Who you see, are you watching? People just seem to get things done to take what you're saying and implement it.
Who are you watching to get it done?
Friends or leaders.
I would just say I have an endless string of friends and activists, organizers, colleagues, clergy colleagues, artists, you know, like Marvin, who's from another planet, actually, in terms of the level of giftedness. There are just so many folks that are just sort of ordinary folks that don't get the press that are making it happen. But I think one of the things in the activist community, there's a tendency to want to change the world without us having to change ourselves. And I think that there needs to be a better balance of the work, of particularly for people that name the name of Christ. We have to become high-cost disciples. Like, we've got to be able to do the discipleship work simultaneous with sort of exercising our moral agency, to get things done in the world. Because I think particularly as it relates to white progressives, people often have not done the work. We're acting onto things. We're imposing our agency, our knowledge, as I said, which often we think is, we know more than other people. I think that's across the board than other people know about themselves. Feel sorry for people that actually feel sorrier for us. So I think it's got to be a balance of the internal work, and that creates something that is organic for us to move out. It's sort of like when we talk about doing anti-racist work. You're not really ready to do anti-racist work if you don't have an intimate relationship with anybody of color. Let's just start there. You know what I'm saying? It's like in order to do some work with the Poor People's Campaign, you need to be trying to get in relationship with poor impacted people themselves, right? And so often we're doing things that are not necessarily the first things we need to do. And the last thing that I would say is I think, we deal with our own pain as a first act of resistance. That is also work. Freud said that, there's something called the repetition compulsion, which is our, tendency to act out onto other people, the things that the pain that we ourselves have experienced. And if you've been stabbed in the chest, back to the grievance, are you going to run about to get the person that stabbed you, or are you going to pull the knife out of your own chest? So I think there's got to be a fundamental balance between this and this, particularly for progressive people.
And so there are plenty of folks on the ground and grassroots that folks won't know. Molly and I had an experience where we were just walking around Oakland, and I introduced her to my friend Regina, who runs a thrift store that doubles as a safe house for women who are trying to get out of sex trafficking. A very real place in the middle of Oakland. There are other artists who are doing this kind of prophetic placemaking and ritual placemaking by creating art that is spiritual and grounded in community. So when you pass by these neighborhoods that you can no longer afford to live in, there is something spiritual happening there. So your walk home, however far out it is now, is a spiritual journey. And that your place in that place that is now built over and gentrified is not lost. But I also think the work of the imagination and the artists, we're doing this work. I have to retell myself stories all the time to get out of the stories. My grandmother was a maid in Montclair to the Steins. If any of you know the Steins, we're still looking for reparations. But, my grandmother lived in public housing, and I'm like, what if the only way she could imagine living in a house on a hill as a black woman was to go and work and raise their kids and clean and be the woman of that house, which is basically what she was. So there's just work in the imagination that is huge, that has to happen, in addition to the on the ground work that we look to. But we have to look to artists and prophetic folks as much as we think to look at strategists and and pundits and other kinds of organizational leaders.
I would definitely not look to pundits. I think they're paid, to have opinions, and I think you're talking about how do we light a fire under ourselves to convert our anguish into action, right? So there's a couple things I would say quickly. The first is, I think it would be a good idea to stop looking and waiting for somebody else to come along and just say, as you clearly are in your own life, here are the causes and candidates that I believe in, so I'm just going to devote a larger share of the pie of my time and attention to those things. And that might mean I have a little bit less of the pie for plugging into TV or political parody or the other things that we do to kind of therapize ourselves. One of the central things I talk about in Bad Stories is that in fact, you were talking about culture death. Neil Postman, the cultural historian, wrote this book called Amusing Ourselves to Death, and he essentially said America, he wrote it in '85, he was trying to respond to Reagan, the idea that an entertainer was now the president, and that TV was really in ascendance. We hadn't even gotten the internet and, the sort of era of screen addiction that we're in. And what he said is, if we can't have a serious conversation, we're doomed. If we as a public devolve into an audience that simply passively consumes everything as entertainment, then we're doomed. So one of the chapters in the book is a bad story that sort of, I think the left sometimes tells itself while the right is preaching this kind of horror movie to keep their base enthralled on behalf of the sponsors. On the left, oftentimes, our way of dealing with our sense of impotence, really, it's what Postman calls a loop of impotence. I heard some news. What am I to do about that? Fiji has been blown over. What am I to do sitting here, right? It's this loop of impotence that mass media created in us. I think our response, in addition to that basic sense of impotence, to see the civic dysfunction and the political and media dysfunction, is to get distressed about it and then to tune into comedians, very talented comedians, very insightful comedians, who make us feel okay about it, who provide us a kind of short-term therapy for those feelings of distress, and who I think drain us of a certain kind of necessary anger and indignation about why a country so abundant in resources is so stingy in its compassion. And so I think, I can tell from your question that you're upset about things, and I would say, great, that's a good thing to be upset, and then to convert that into action. And I would also say that the dark matter in our public life, politically, is the apathetic. The faction that won the election by 45 million votes were the people, the citizens who didn't exercise their franchise. They got 104 million votes. And so, and it's predominantly, and it's skewed towards young people who have the most to gain or lose by participating in the duties of citizenship. So one thing that I do say is, maybe it's a good idea to try to unplug from the bad stories that we're wallowing in and to try to figure out how can I plug into a system that tells stories to voters who are turned off, that makes them understand the tremendous stakes that, in November and every election that we have. The night of the election, we had a babysitter, because of course we went out to celebrate, like the virtuous white people we are, and she was a young woman who was going to medical school. And I said, because I'm this kind of person, before we left, I said, here's how you take care of our kids. I didn't care about that. I said, she was from North Carolina. I said, well, you did vote, didn't you? And she said, yeah, the deadline was I think I missed it. I had to do an absentee ballot, and I think I missed it. And I thought, you're going to medical school. There's a difference here. You're going to wind up to your eyeballs in hock.
Right, that's right.
If one political candidate wins, the other candidate kept trying anyway to talk about what she wanted to do for students of higher education. So I think that it's not going to come through mass media. Mass media is too ruled by the sort of stimulation impulse. But there has got to be a way to somehow plug into communities that are civically disengaged, but whose fates are tremendously impacted by the political decisions that we make.
Just say one quick thing, quick. I think it's also a different, there's a mystic, and I'm getting confused about whether it's Thomas Merton or Meister Eckhart, but he said success is not a name of God. And there's this way that I think sometimes we're looking for in the culture, which is the opposite of what you're saying in some ways and doing, the gentleman that raised the question. We're looking for some charismatic figure or something grandiose. And it's an amazing thing if we think to raise $100,000, we need 100 people that have $1,000. And, power is sort of organized money or organized people. And there's so much that we can do if we can organize people to actually do small things. Colin Kaepernick took a knee. That's what he did. He took a knee, But what was it? He was providing a counter-narrative and some resistance to the powers, basically. And so I think that that's the reminder for those of us that are activists and even those that are not activists or consider yourselves to be organizers. Lots of things. Martin King said everybody can be great because everybody can serve. And so the thing is to find out where is your passion. You know, for whatever reason, maybe you care about rape because you were raped, but for whatever reason, get out there and get busy, and you'll cross-fertilize with other people that will make you test your own assumptions and presuppositions as you bump up against them, and that happens for me, and that happens for everybody, and we'll be better people.
We'll do Carrie's question real quick with haiku-length answers, perhaps, so that there's time to visit with you afterward.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so Marvin, you answered this just in part, but one of the questions, we're talking about what to do, what to move forward, and one of the things, I was just thinking about this walking in today, is that when I think of a problem, maybe it's violence, whatever it is, I find myself struggling to be able to imagine, truly imagine what something different looks like. So, and I think that when we're trying to move, so where do you call from? And you mentioned, you know, mystics and artists, but how do you create that vision? Because I need to see, so I need to be able to imagine something else that's possible. And I think, well, a world without violence, yeah, but I can't imagine what that looks like.
Wakanda forever?
I'll say really quickly, again, on a small scale, I think, you know, again, for progressives, I think it's we want freedom, but we don't often know what we want freedom for. And so it's sort of, I think we create collective projects of freedom on small scales. I'll give a quick example in my own community. When Prop 8 happened, and, you know, I'm a lesbian, which people don't even say anymore. It makes me know I'm 55, just the fact that I call myself a lesbian, like I'm a lesbian. I'm still a lesbian. But in any event, and it was radical to come out in Black church and community. I came out 41 years ago. That was very, very radical to do. And so anyway, so anyway, back to just some examples of that. People were complaining, and white lesbians in my own church, some of you know that I pastored First Congregational Church, predominantly white. When I went to First Congregational Church, there were 2 people of color, 1 Korean man, 1 African-American woman. And so white lesbians in the church were like, you know, Black people, you know, there's more homophobia in the communities, or what. That didn't come to me immediately because they had a Black woman pastor, but I got that sort of in the wind. We went, I said, nope, we're gonna start with a genuine love for Black people. And so what we're gonna do is I want you, who have PhDs and master's degrees and all of that, and are foisting and projecting this on to folks in Black communities, let's work with formerly incarcerated African-American men. You work with formerly incarcerated African-American men. Then there were recyclers, you know, in the community, and those people are considered to be, you know, folks that just go through your trash. No, they're actually environmentalists and are working against environmental racism. So let's have gentrifier environmentalists who don't really care about environmental justice or don't really understand the environmental injustice work with recyclers. You see what I'm saying? So that they can sort of be, you know, so it's marriage equality advocates working with formerly incarcerated men, you know, African-American men. Those kinds of pairings made us literally break out of violence. And there are lots of forms of violence. It doesn't have to be community gun violence or police murder or whatever. There's the violence of respectability and conventionality. And so we can work outside of the bounds of this when we just try. So that became an alternative community. People literally moved into West Oakland, places in East Oakland, and began to sort of cross-fertilize with folks that were very, 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 very different. And if you look at First Congregational Church now, which is a lay-led church, right, you see that capacity. There aren't white people in Oakland that are more committed, right, and show another, put their lives on the line for Black Lives Matter, you know, for affordable housing, those kinds of things, than some of those folks at First Oakland, right? And some of that came out of the fact that it was like, no, let's do it for real. Let's not talk about interculturalism. Let's do it. That is a form of anti-violence when we do that.
I think for me, you know, really as a church person, as a person who believes, I always think that the work starts here. If we're a church, we need to deal with the violence of the church before we can imagine a world without violence. I feel like a lot of times, and I've talked to to different folks about how it feels as a Christian. It's like we're walking around on eggshells waiting for God to fall off the wagon. You know, we know God did all that shit. We know all the violence, but we pretend like we put it out of our heads, you know, and we know that it's possible, but the story and the good news like erases all of that, but it doesn't remove the imprint on our DNA that something, God could get mad again, you know. And so I don't think we've even dealt with the violence that we've inherited just by stepping into church, you know. And I think there's a place for us to deal with this violence before we can picture a violence not existing in the world. And the other part of that is that we have to, when we imagine a world without violence, it can't always be a violence against somebody else. We have to imagine a world of violence where we're not violated. Because when we think of a world without violence, we often think of black people not being violated or women not being violated. I mean, but how is a world without violence impacting you personally?
Well, I'd just say quickly that the Parkland kids, in a way, were able to kind of remind us, really. They were kind of like these teachers who said, actually, when a school gets shot up, because our culture is awash in guns, because there's a profit in them that are guns, the appropriate response of the victims is not to sort of passively receive the prayers and thoughts of, but to actually stand up and say, these stories that we're hearing are completely insane. They're fraudulent, they're propagandistic, and every other, industrialized country has solved this problem of excessive gun violence, every single one, by simply reducing the number of weapons in their midst. So now they haven't broken through, there's still this entrenched gun lobby and so forth, but they at least started to debunk those bad stories. And one thing I would do, and I try to do this in the book because I don't want it to just be a Debbie Downer kind of book, is to remind people, there should be a series of hats that say, Make America Great Again, the Emancipation Proclamation. Make America Great Again, the War on Poverty. Make America Great Again, the New Deal. Make America great. You see what I mean? It's not as if our history is just one of unremitting greed and iniquity. There are all these reminders in our past that we're capable of making real moral progress. It's just always inconvenient. It causes us to have to defamiliarize our world and move outside of our comfort zones and detach from the passive consumption of news to enact the change that we want to see. And it is in our history. I know because when I was 4 or 5 years old, my parents sat me down and said, hey, Dad's going to go to jail for a couple of days. And I said, what are you talking about? He's protesting the Vietnam War. And he was scared. It was a year after 1968. He was trembling, holding hands to prevent, vehicles from coming into an Air Force base. But he did that. And so if you hear that story, and if your children and the other people in your world see you enacting your values in the world, that's a story that they're seeing. And our children are the stories that we send out into the world. You know what I mean? It's a possibility that the pendulum swings back in a more merciful direction, but only if we engineer the swing. So.
Amen. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Lynice. Thank you, Marvin.
We concede nothing to death.
We
concede nothing to death.
We concede nothing to death.
Love wins, death gets nothing. That's right.
Amen, amen. Steve has a few minutes to sign books out in the hall of entrance. Anything else? And the proceeds, he's generously donating all the proceeds to BOSS, Building Opportunities for Self-Sufficiency, which we're here today. Yes. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.